Thank you so much for joining us today for another webinar in our Science Communicator in Residence webinar series. We are thrilled to have all of you here with us. I'm Owen Stockton, Director of Marketing and Communications for the Faculty of Science. And once again, we're thrilled and excited to have Dr. Anne Moser, our Science Communicator in Residence, here for us today for another webinar, and to have with us as well a special guest. I'm thrilled and excited about this one. So Anne, I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Owen. Yes, it is my pleasure to interview John Rennie today. He is a special guest for this webinar. When Jay and I were setting up the Science Communications program at the Banff Center, it must have been, well over 15 years ago now, we had a friend who knew John in New York, and she had told us John would be a great faculty member. And we thought, there's no way somebody as esteemed and busy as John Rennie would ever come all the way up to Banff in Western Canada to spend 2 weeks working with aspiring science communicators. But it turned out that his gig at Scientific American, which he held for 15 years as editor-in-chief, was coming to a close, and he was up for it. Since then, we had the great honor of spending 2 weeks for many summers in a row with John. And I have to say, it's one thing to be one of the best people in the world at what you do. It's another thing to be humble enough and fun enough to spend 2 weeks helping others do it. And that's exactly what he did. His list of his pedigree in science communications is amazing. Not only Scientific American, during his tenure, they won 2 national magazine awards. He was deputy editor at Quantum magazine for more than 7 years. He's been on almost every television show in the US that touches on science that you could think of. He actually was the creator and host of Hacking the Planet, which was on the Weather Channel. I could go on and on. As I said, he's a great teacher, and since 2009, he has been an adjunct instructor at New York University, where he is working with graduate students in the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program. So that, by way of introduction, tells you a little bit about John. John, let's hear from you. You were editor for 15 years. At the world's most famous science magazine, and others and others. I've seen you in action. You are truly a marvel at how quickly you can turn a scientist's experience into a story that others might want to read. So I want to ask you how you do it, but first I want to ask you why you do it. What motivated you to be a science editor?
Oh, well, all right. First of all, let me say thank you so much. It's always a delight to work with you again, Anne, and actually just a great treat to get a chance to come back and speak to everybody there in the faculty at the University of Calgary again, too. But I do this really for the same reason that pretty much people get involved in science at all for any reason. Fundamentally, I just love the sort of the act of the discovery, the learning new things, being able to explain those things that I've been learning to other people as best I can. I'm somebody who had started off thinking I might pursue a career in biological research and particularly neuroscience. But I'd also always had a lot of interests in writing and editing, and I eventually decided to sort of commit myself entirely to that end of things, in no small part because, as I said, it was perfect for my dilettantish streak, which is that the nature of being a scientific researcher is you have to spend your years and years of your life working on one tiny little problem, and I like being able to jump from one thing to the next. One of the joys of being able to work at a magazine like Scientific American was the fact that I got to, for a couple of months at a time, I'd be working with the scientist authors. I could have the illusion of becoming briefly an expert in a different sort of field and then moving on to something else again. So that's what really drives me. Just, I love the science and I love to be able to share it.
Yeah. I mean, Scientific American and being based in New York, that's a very competitive environment. What do you think set you apart?
I mean, honestly, I don't know how much really did. Let's first of all acknowledge the tremendous influence of luck in almost anybody's career, and absolutely in mine. And I can, I can chalk a lot of it up to a certain amount of the, working hard, taking advantage of opportunities, the things we would also all say about that. I would say the most important thing was that when I was learning to do these things, I I really committed myself to trying to listen to and learn from everybody in every part of the process of publishing that I was involved with. So listening to the scientists when I was talking to them, but also really learning a lot from my immediate editors, from the copy editors, from the fact checkers, all the different parts of the operation that goes into the huge collaborative enterprise that is publishing, and really trying to make sure that I would make a lot of mistakes, but I would make a lot of the right mistakes. And I would try not to keep repeating the same dumb mistakes repeatedly. So frankly, it was just a matter of getting better and better at being able to do those things. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got very early on with that was to really approach the work with a kind of the kind of passion that I imagine shows in my voice now that I talked about before about why I got into any of this at all, which is I love doing it and I want other people to love reading it or watching it or listening to it, however they're experiencing the science. I want them to love it as much as I and everybody else involved in the science does.
So take us a little bit behind the scenes of working at Scientific American. What's the most surprising part of that job, or what was?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's one thing is I think people probably have a very poor idea of what in the world people who are involved in anything like, science, working at a science magazine is like anyway. And I mean, the good thing is that so much of the time does actually involve getting to sit down and work on the manuscripts and talking to the scientists and being involved in doing those things. At different stages of my time there, and especially as an editor-in-chief, I would often get sort of pulled out of a lot of the enterprise of science. So sadly, I think as with a lot of senior scientists find that the surprising part of the job is that they are actually administrators and managers more than they are the thing that they thought they would be doing. So we sort of claw our way back into doing a lot of those things. But yeah, I think that's kind of for me what the biggest surprise was.
Yeah, I guess so. That's right. Things have changed a lot, right? I mean, you were there in the glory days, or I would call it the glory days of science publishing, big, thick magazines.
Mhm.
And now in an era of, TikTok and Reels, and how have things changed?
Yeah, arguably I started to arrive like really like coming to Scientific American just after what might have been the real heyday, because in the early 1980s, that was when you were seeing a real explosion of a lot of science magazines. There were many of them that were taking off. And the reason they were taking off was because coming out of the 70s, there was actually a lot of different kinds of commercial advertising that could go into a lot of those sorts of magazines, which meant that initially a lot of places all thought they could support themselves with advertising. Then they started to discover they could not do that kind of thing. The odd irony, and I'm sorry if this is sort of too much publishing inside baseball for people, but it is useful for understanding kind of like some of the pressures that affect all of this, is that science as an area of publishing and broadcasting has always been extremely popular with audiences. They love that, but it's very, very hard to convince a lot of advertisers to back that kind of thing. And so a lot of the pressures that science publishing in all different media experience are the ones of trying to find some way to support all of the work done. In a way, we're in a different kind of golden age now, in that there are more opportunities and arguably more people involved in being able to communicate science now than ever before. And there is great work going on at whatever level of sophistication you would like to see. The problem is that relatively few people get to do that in a way that they can sort of support themselves in the comfortable way that once would sort of be taken for granted. So that's what puts a lot of pressure on things, is how the limitations of that start to impose on what there's space to do and how much things have to be driven just as sort of passion projects for people.
Yeah. Can you tell us a story about, a highlight from your time there? Something that would
Gosh.
take us behind the scenes?
I mean, there were lots of great things about that. The thing that really always pops to mind is one particular planning session when we were working on a big single topic issue that was itself sort of a grab bag of kind of like the, 10 greatest mysteries in science kind of topic. And we had just pulled together for this the potential authors for that issue. And it was just in one room sitting there alongside like Carl Sagan and Stephen Jay Gould and just so many other noted physicists and chemists and people in just so many different areas. Was like sitting in that one room was like, wow, this is so astonishing. Similarly, like an opportunity I had to like then be, having like a private dinner with Murray Gell-Mann, possibly the world's smartest man. Certainly in his own mind, for sure. That's the kind of thing that, that was the kind of thing that was the great thing about like working at the magazine, was being able to have those kinds of exchanges and that sense of experiencing something with these great scientists. And in a lot of ways, that's what the wonderful thing about Scientific American, about what we were trying to do for readers, that sitting at home, they would feel like they were in the presence of these same kinds of amazing minds.
Yeah, so amazing minds like that, and also scientists from all around the world working on, every number of things.
Mhm.
Um, in working with scientists in general, the very famous and the new, the
Mhm.
rising stars, um, what has this taught you about scientists?
Um, that scientists, they are, you want to be very careful about being speaking too stereotypically or homogeneously about them, because there are ones who are terrific communicators and ones who are less good communicators. And there are even sort of the quality of the science that people do. There are great people who are not so great scientists, but are fantastic at communicating the science, and ones who are great scientists and are not very good at communicating it at all. It's taught me it's really important to always listen to them, and to absorb not just the kind of the scientific information relating to their discoveries that they're trying to pass on, but also to trying to understand a lot of the other concerns that they have, the ones of the sort of the penumbra of other worries that they might have that surround their own descriptions of the work, that reflect of just where do we need to be really, really careful about making sure that we're not overstepping, or that we're not bringing in too much false hope, not sensationalizing when we don't mean to. The other thing that was sort of interesting was seeing that again, broad generalization, different fields. I think the cultures of those different sciences sometimes are they vary in the degrees to which they are already comfortable with dealing with the general public. So, for example, for the most part, a lot of astronomers and geologists were actually great to talk with, because when you would and work with them on articles, because I think there is a history of them understanding of doing a lot of outreach to the general public, and a lot of them have internalized a certain sense of why that's important and why some of the kinds of details that will get scrubbed away. Um, with no disrespect to anybody else, sort of on the other end of things, I could say like a lot of PhD MDs talking about biomedical work were often much stickier to work with. Some of that's understandable because they're literally dealing with issues that relate to life and death. But I think in some cases, because of their medical training, some of them maybe overestimated how good they might be at being able to speak to a public audience all at once, as opposed to sitting at a patient's bedside. And so sometimes I would be involved with like more kinds of wrestling with people over exactly the way to couch some of those kinds of things.
That's kind of surprising, because you think about people working in health or physiology, everybody has a body, everybody can relate. Whereas
Yeah.
somebody working in physics, it can be really esoteric. So that's kind of ironic.
Yeah, it is kind of funny. I think that sometimes certain number of things about just sort of the nature of medical training, and I'm maybe unfairly blaming it a little more on the MD side of this more than the PhD side of this, but I
Yeah.
think that it can give them more confidence that they know how to speak
Yeah.
to the public than maybe they should have.
Yeah. Fair enough. Do you think scientists in general are getting more skilled at talking to mainstream audiences?
I think so. I mean, it's very hard to say, and there are always huge outliers often in every direction. But I think that one thing is that, if nothing else, the rise of social media has tended to make it more routine for a lot of people relatively early on in their scientific careers to start talking to the outside world. And I
Yeah.
think that immediately gives them a certain level of experience with how to do that right and how to do that wrong. Um, Certainly doesn't mean that everybody's an expert at this, but I think that more people will have a little more lived experience with knowing what the benefits and the disadvantages of that can be.
Yeah. And what about the culture of science as a whole? Do you think that there is more, we used to call it the Carl Sagan effect, where fellow
Mhm.
scientists were super hard on scientists that did too much work with the media. Do you think that's changing?
The when I hear scientists talk about it, sadly, I do get the impression that that's still a fairly big consideration. That for a lot of them, there is a worry that if they are perceived as doing too much about in the area of public outreach, they can be seen as somehow not serious.
Yeah.
Again, I wouldn't be shocked if that varied a little bit between different fields.
Yeah.
Obviously, I would tend to think that's an unfortunate prejudice to have abroad among scientists. But I do think that there is a lot of real evidence to support the idea that, on balance, science as a whole and whole scientific fields benefit from getting out there and making the case for what they are doing to the public, because of course the public in the end, they're the ones who are footing the bill for everything too.
Yeah, yeah. So if I asked you explicitly, what would you tell a scientist? Why, what reasons should they get involved in communicating about their work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an enormous amount of like personal fun and gratification that can come from it that I can speak to and testify to, firsthand, and a lot of other science communicators that I know who are actually working scientists also tremendously, benefit from that. But I think in a sense, almost to approach it from sort of the negative side of things, the public understands science because of the information that's being passed through the media of science journalists and others. A lot of us who work in science journalism, we take very seriously the problem of trying to be telling truthful stories about about science and about the scientists that's happening. But and there are certainly mistakes that are made. But I think the key thing is that if you the involvement of scientists helps make those stories better. And the reality is, if scientists don't get involved in helping to tell the stories of their research, somebody else is going to tell stories about their research, and they probably will not be as good. They may not be as truthful, and they will probably may be unfortunate for the consequences of the fields because of that.
Yeah. And what about, the thing that Nancy Barron, our friend who lives down in California, often says about being a better communicator makes you a better scientist. Do you see
I
that?
mean, I think so. I think, it's again, I can only sort of testify from it from sort of one side of the street, but I think that it does, to the extent that solving a lot of problems, really difficult problems, sometimes means being able to step completely back and look at things completely as an outsider to things. That quality of being able to step back, take yourself back out of thing and look at a problem as a sort of blank slate and come back in and approach things, I think that probably does help some of them. But I think it's just the process of I think it's a version of the experience that I think a lot of researchers know from that sometimes by virtue of being teachers, they feel like it helps make them better researchers because they are explaining the work better and they are coming to new understandings of it as they figure out ways of being able to explain that to their student audiences. When you are doing that to a wider public audience, the same kind of thing occurs. You realize things. I've learned much more about science in the process of working as a science journalist than I ever did during the years that I was seriously studying that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you say you're on the one side, that's true. what advice would you have for the people on the other side, for the scientists when they're working with people like you or writers?
Yeah. I mean, I
Editing?
think that speaking with them, I think it's helpful to try to approach that as a kind of collaboration, knowing that you're approaching it as a kind of collaboration. Um, and again, there are terrible science communicators and terrible science journalists who ruin things for the rest of us, but most people are honestly trying to get what you are doing and wanting to be able to present that to the public in the right way. Now, the right way for that public is not necessarily the way that you as scientists may always be thinking about it, because the job of the science journalist is not just one of being able to report facts. It's about being able to curate which facts are going to be reported on, and also being able to tell stories about those kinds of facts. And this is why, in some ways, it is useful to trust the good journalists, that they will know how to tell the right kinds of stories about the work. That's not to say that you can't engage in, real discussions of it, criticize it, and talk with them about how things are done. But understand that just because the reporters do not want to simply parrot back in their stories all of the things that you might like them to be saying, does not mean they are not doing their job right. And it does not mean that the public is not actually getting the best version of what this is, because those of us who are involved in media, we understand who our audiences are extremely well. So it's good to look at it as a kind of collaboration where you, the researchers, you obviously are the experts on the science, but in terms of figuring out how best to convey that science to somebody else, be open to the kind of suggestions and guidance and choices that these other people may be making. It's an imperfect process, but it's one that approaching it that kind of collaboration works more often than not.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really neat way of thinking about it, especially as I look into the chat and see if we have a bit of time for some questions, and I see a couple of questions that are really related about what the impact of the fact that this is a collaboration and not a direct. So the first question is, how do you build an audience if you're not sociable or likable? So there's the scientist who on their own
Yep.
is worried about engaging with the audience. And then on the
Mhm.
other side, there's a question about, what do you say to people who are prioritizing personality, say, before scientific accuracy or breadth and depth?
Yeah, so let's see. Dealing with the two different parts about that.
Yeah.
Building audiences is hard. So it can take a long time, and different media, social media and otherwise, it can be very difficult to get a lot of purchase about that. I will say that especially where there are social components to things, like with different social media, doing a lot to start off by interacting and like serving as somebody who helps to pass on other people's messages, where you see other people who are doing good science talking about good science, where if you can start like whatever we would have called retweeting, but now not that. So reskeeting, quoting, doing other things where you are echoing what other people are doing, that helps. There's a tendency for people to start to want to return the favor, going back the other way. So a certain level of interacting with people, and you don't have to be. It's, believe me, the ranks of science communicators and a huge number of very, very shy, often socially awkward people. I've been in rooms full of them. I know. So these can be your people. It's okay. Just interacting with them can be okay, and that can start to sort of help those things along for being able to do it. But it is tough to build audiences. That's absolutely true. People who are making choices about, like, they want to be personalities first, and that they want to lead with the personality, and the science may suffer in the process of, like, you just have to sometimes, people are just going to do that kind of thing. There's no good way of being able to stop them. It's probably not super productive in practice to spend a lot of time trying to, um, shout those people down, trying to engage in them, fight with them, that kind of thing of, like, you know what, they're going to find an audience of some kind, for better or not, and you're not really going to be able to stop that so easily. It's better for you to keep on concentrating on providing finding the other better audience that wants to listen to things done right. Again, not a perfect sort of answer on any of that thing, but there isn't a simple, clean answer for any of it.
Okay, here's a question in the chat, and you may not want to answer this. What do you think about people who view science in practice as being politicized?
Let's see, I feel like my answer to that is going to be sort of complicated. I mean, I think there are people who will sometimes argue that, like, oh, science should never be politicized. Science shouldn't be political. And I mean, I think we all understand the frame of mind that leads to that. And a lot of us, we would love to be operating in a certain kind of space where the science and the politics were very cleanly distinct. But my perspective on the world these days is that, quite frankly, there's no alternative these days. One, you have people who are choosing to politicize different types of the science, whether the scientists want to engage with that or not, and it's usually to the detriment of the science. So again, it's like, if the scientists don't get involved and try to make sure that the right kinds of things are being said about this, however political that might be, then almost certainly the wrong kinds of things are going to be used. And I don't see that as being good for anyone either. That doesn't mean throwing in the towel and, being incredibly partisan on all different kinds of matters, but being able to recognize that certain kinds of fields, certain kinds of discoveries, again, whether we like it or not, these days especially, they are very, very wrapped up in different kinds of things, and they are going to be hot buttons for this. If you're doing reproductive research, guess what? You're in a highly politicized field, and you may not want it to be, but it is.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and it's a good one. Do you think writers with an interest in science or scientists with an interest in writing or, communicating, which is better for a place like Scientific American?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot at different times, and I've seen and actually looked at it in the case of the colleagues that I had at Scientific American.
Yeah.
Genuinely, no actual difference.
Okay.
It's like in the field sort of split up that different way. Like the heights of different people and I won't say the lows that different people reach. It doesn't neatly split. There was somebody who was one of the best editors that Scientific American ever had, was somebody who had been trained entirely as a geoscientist, and he had never worked any place in editing before coming to Scientific American, but he was absolutely fantastic at it. And there are people who have shown that they're fantastically good at covering a wide range of different sciences very, very thoughtfully, and they only have training as journalists. So yeah, it's the passion and desire to engage matters much more than your specific background.
Right. Okay. Well, that is all the time we have. Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you.